to see how easy it is to live stream on YouTube. Among the courses that I teach is a course on social networks. And one of the things that is interesting is at the beginning of the semester, when I ask my students to describe what a social network is, very often they will come back at me with responses such as Facebook or Pinterest or basically social network sites. The thing is, Facebook, Twitter, all of these social network sites are not social networks. They are simply visual representations of social networks. There are different ways that social networks have been represented. Perhaps one of the most well-known that many of us have seen has been a series of circles, each circle representing a person, and they're connected by lines. I often tell my students to think of those lines as pipes, because part of what makes a social network work is that people are connected by something. They may be connected by elements of power or leadership or responsibility. They might be connected by blood. They could be connected by a shared history. They are very often, especially when we think of social networking sites, people are connected by an affinity, whether it be friendship, whether it be familial love, etc. When I teach this course, the approach that I take is that I want my students to understand that social networks surround us, and they have a great deal of impact on the world as we perceive it, as we understand it, as it was, and as it is evolving, what it is evolving into. So I begin with looking at empires and how, look at our earliest empires, the Grecian Empire, the areas around Babylon, how initially you didn't have some of the affordances that we had today. One of the ways these civilizations imposed themselves was through what Innes refers to as space-based media, space or space-biased media, meaning they were large, they were durable, they stood the test of time, and they were difficult, if not impossible, to move. When you think of something such as the Sphinx or the Acropolis, those were clear symbols to people of that time of whatever that particular culture represented. And they were fixed in that place so that anyone coming to that place could see this is what that culture was. Moving along, when you get to the Romans, who in some ways you may think of as the first great superpower, the Romans not only did things such as built temples and aqueducts, but they also began to move even more deeply into what Innes refers to as time-biased media. This is media that tends to be more ephemeral, media that can be moved more quickly. And one of the first and probably one of the most important communication tools that the Romans built were roads. Now, we don't normally talk about travel by sea. We normally don't talk of that in terms of being a communication medium, but travel is. If you think about it, sort of extending things historically, one of the innovations that the Romans brought is you could travel from Rome, which is one end of the empire, the center of the empire, all the way to the British Isles within about 3 months. Now, today, that sounds insane to us. I mean, if you're in New York, you can be in London in a little under 6 hours. However, considering that prior to that time, when there were no roads or paved roads or paths, it could have taken 2 or 3 times as long to make that trip. The fact that you could now quickly move armies, which was the primary goal of the Romans, as meant you could also move merchandise, It also meant that people who were wealthy could travel. So you have the invention of the vacation. So if you lived in a part of the empire that became very warm and stuffy in the summer, you could travel north to a place that was cooler. All of these things came about as a result of having an organized and mapped out road system. It also that instead of someone going away and perhaps never seeing or hearing from loved ones again, you now have the ability to establish a mail system. So people could send messages. So perhaps if I lived in Rome and my sister moved to Spain, I might never see her again, but the possibility now existed that I could occasionally send a message to her. I might be able to exchange presents, albeit nowhere near as quickly as we can today, but this was something that didn't exist at all. So again, when we talk about empires in the context of them being social networks, instead of each one of those circles representing a person connected to someone else, with an empire, what you're really talking about are political units. So within the Roman Empire, you may have had, Rome. Spain was part of the Roman Empire. Gaul, which is present-day France. Certainly most of what is now Great Britain was also part of the empire. So that's one way to think of an empire is as a massive social network. And when you talk about empires, you're also talking about another feature of social networks is that they don't remain static. Over time, empires change. They grow, they amass area, and then with most empires, they eventually do lose parts of themselves as pieces become independent or rebel, or in the case of Rome, the empire begins to kind of implode upon itself. Another example that I talk about at some length in my class is the example of the British Empire. The British Empire, one of the things that made it interesting is that old cliche that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And one of the things I demonstrate to my students, courtesy of some really nice graphics that I obtained through Common Creative License on Wikipedia, is when you look at the British Empire at its height, which would have been roughly around the turn of the 20th century on maybe into the early 20s, what you see is literally in every time zone there's a piece of the British Empire, because it extended from Europe through Africa, through Asia. Obviously, you have Australia, New Zealand, some of the Pacific Islands. There was a small outpost, British Guyana, obviously Canada. Even though we as the U.S. had left Britain, almost 150 years before, there were still parts of the British Empire that literally stretched around the globe. So if we think of empires in terms of being these massive networks, we have to begin to think, how do these pieces of the empire, how do they remain connected? And there are several ways that was accomplished. One is, again, let's invoke travel. One of the ways the British Empire kind of maintained itself is by travel. Once folks kind of worked out the ability to sail a ship over long distances, once that barrier was cracked, then obviously many countries, not only the English, but also the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, all took to the seas. And instead of reaching the Far East, they hit what we now know today as the Western Hemisphere first. And they were all intent on, staking their little piece of land. As in the innovation of roads, what this kind of consistent sort of sea travel enabled is the ability for people to not only move goods, not only move armies, but also to move themselves. So someone might choose, for example, in Great Britain, maybe a second or third or fourth son who knows that he won't inherit much may decide to go to the quote-unquote New World to make his way. Obviously, we know that there were British citizens who were convicted, that were, I love the word they use, transported to Australia as a penalty. And obviously, when we talk about humans and sort of the confluence of when humans are treated as chattel, there were African slaves that were moved from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean and to the United States as well. So what connected the British Empire was travel. Later on, we had more advanced technologies such as telegraphs, and there were trunk lines that were literally laid through the ocean, under the ocean, with the wires to facilitate telegraphs, and obviously telephones later on. But also there was something else that connected the British Empire, and we also saw this with Rome, and it is culture. In much the same way that a community, a town, a high school, a family shares a type of culture, obviously civilizations do too, empires do as well. One of the things I point out to my students is if you make a list of all of the countries that speak English, it's a rather impressive list. I believe, and I apologize for not having the statistic with me, that English is, I believe, the third or fourth most common spoken language in the world. And if you think about it, why is it that not only is English spoken in England, but it's spoken in Canada, in the United States? It's certainly one of the first or second language of many people who live in Hong Kong and other parts of Asia. It's a first or second language for many people that live in India, and so on. It's because the English exported their culture everywhere they went. And that culture included not just the way they dressed, but also how they worshiped, what they believed. This is why you have Desmond Tutu, who's an Anglican bishop in South Africa. South Africa was an English colony. They exported their education, and this is something that you see amongst a number of more modern empires, is the exporting of education. Through education, you are acculturating children in the way you want them to be acculturated. You're teaching them to be good citizens of whatever their political subdivision is. In the case of the British Empire, children were taught to speak English. They were taught English history, all of these things that the British deemed necessary to be good citizens of the British Empire. Now, I want to say up front that we're not talking necessarily about any kind of equality, but a common understanding of what it means to be British. And again, even though the United States, even though we separated from Britain fairly early on, probably one of the first, if not the first, of her holdings to break away, we do still share many parts of that culture, not just the language. We also share, our basic educational system. Although there are differences, there are also many similarities. So when we talk about empires as these massive social networks, they are what we call the nodes, or the individual pieces, aren't people, but instead are political subdivisions. So they might be countries, city-states, etc. And they're held together by media, whether it's these massive time-biased structures that don't really move, but that transmit culture, again, like the Acropolis or the Statue of Liberty, or we're talking about space-based media that tends to be more ephemeral. We can talk about messages going through the internet. We can talk about newspapers, journals, diaries, things that are on paper. The ways that these empires perpetuate themselves by making sure that people have access to what it means to be a, fill in the blank. Whether it's going to a certain place, whether it's consuming certain media, whether it is having a certain common understanding. One of the reasons that we send children to school is not just so they can learn to read and write and so forth, but it's also to make them good citizens, however a particular culture defines a good citizen. If you talk to a child who's gone through the entire educational system here in the United States, if you ask them who the first president is, almost all of them will tell you George Washington. Ask them, if you show them a picture of the White House, most of them will be able to identify it. That's because, as empires go, these are cultural icons that have been presented again and again through education, through mass media, and they represent some element of who a particular culture is. As I'm often fond of pointing out, there's a reason why, when you think of the United States, very often the image that comes to mind is the bald eagle or the cowboy. It's that idea of the rugged individualist. When you compare this to other cultures where the is more of a collaborative effort, you can begin to see the significant differences that culture makes. And the interesting thing is culture connections is pipes. Culture is what flows through those pipes. That's what connects those parts of the empire, even though each part of the empire may have its own variation. I mean, certainly here in the United States, we speak English. I can speak to someone who's Canadian, and someone not even realize they're Canadian. I can speak to someone who's Australian, and I know immediately that they're probably not from the United States. I can understand, in most cases, at least 90% of what they're saying, although there are sometimes I've spoken to people from Australia where I had a much more difficult time understanding what they were saying, and I'm sure they didn't have the easiest time understanding what I was saying either. So yes, there are local variations, but the overall culture is the same. If you speak English, somewhere in your culture, you've probably been introduced to Shakespeare, in some form or another. So now we've talked about probably the largest sort of social network unit that I discuss with my students, which is the empire. Later classes, we go on to discuss multinational networks, organizations, different types of volunteer organizations, until about halfway through the semester, we get to our personal social networks. Those connections which help to shape us, help to sustain us, and help us to shape and sustain others. Thank you very much for sitting in on this test, and we'll speak again soon.